Awesome. Hi, Julian. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here and doing this with us.
You're
Um,
welcome. It's gonna be fun.
it's going to be great because you're here to talk to us about a lot of exciting and very interesting things today. And you are the host of a group and a website called Myths or History.
That is correct. There's a
Yes.
lot more going on at the group than there is the website currently. The website has been under construction for years and is still under construction, but there's lots of activity at the group almost daily, really. And
Yeah, and it's a great.
I try to keep new posts pumping through from different fields and disciplines as often as I can.
Yeah, it's a great resource and it's a great group of people. Got some nice people.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, and you also have a project that you worked on a few years ago, and that's how I met you was through the your Jupiter myth.
That is
Um,
correct. Yes.
yeah, so so we know these things about you, and I haven't got to talk to you in a while.
Yeah,
What if
it's true.
what what you been doing lately?
Well, I definitely have been doing some work on the Jupiter myth, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Another thing that's been going on even more recently than that, and it will likely be the first endeavor that I'm working on currently that is the most likely to have a product, something that be brought to fruition the first, because we're making really good progress on this. Things are going really, really well, and we're all really excited about it. And now I'm going to tell you what this is. This
Yeah.
all goes back to the year 1952, actually a little bit before that, because the book wasn't written in 52, it was published in 52, and that is by Immanuel Velikovsky, the first volume of Ages in Chaos. I bet that a lot of people who are listening have probably read this. And they
Yes.
may have read more than one volume in the series, because in fact, there are multiple volumes. The first one was Ages in Chaos. The second one to come out was quite a few years later, more than 20 years later. Actually, I think more like 25 years later. Was the second installment in the Ages in Chaos series, Peoples of the Sea. It's technically not the second volume in the series. In fact, it doesn't really have a volume number placement in the series. It corresponds with the rest of the series.
Mm.
It just happens to be the second one to be published. The third one to be published, which was just before Velikovsky's passing, was Ramses II and His Time. Now, this might get a little confusing, so this is why I'm making a bit of an introduction here with the multiple volumes, is that this is technically volume 4 in the series. So if you like to say, since Peoples of the Sea doesn't really have a volume number, you could say it's volume 5 or whatever. It's the supplement to the 4 volume series, but either way, it's kind of been stated, it's been known since the late 70s that there were 5 volumes to the series, intended and in part written.
Mm.
No one's, the volume 2 and volume 3 have never seen the light of day in a published form before. And
Mm.
that is what I'm excited to announce, is that myself and a wonderful man named Louis Greenberg, who was someone who knew Velikovsky personally back in the 70s and was editor of magazines like Chronos. And I believe he had a hand in Aeon. I hope I didn't get that wrong. I know there was more than one journal he worked on, however. And him and I have been working together on editing the second volume in Ages in Chaos, which is called The Dark Age of Greece. And it's going to be Velikovsky's manuscript is going to be supplemented with a handful of, well, supplements, of appendices, if you will, that more than anything else are going to be bringing the research where it left off in the late 70s forward up till today. And what's really been striking and really exciting so far is the more and more you look at the research that's been done in this area. And with the Dark Age of Greece, we're talking about not only ancient Greece, but also a bit of Egypt and some of Persia, a lot of Persia actually, as well as some of what we now call, Palestine area, if you will, and some other countries as well. If you look at the more modern research, a lot of their results, if you will, or their newer conjectural answers are it's almost like reading an old Velikovsky paper because you would almost think these people were closet catastrophists or something, because they're basically saying, hey, there's so many major problems with these chronologies that, actually this might be here, this might be much later than we thought, by hundreds of years in some cases. So just getting in touch with the newer research has been exciting, and it's going to be exciting to be including that in this, what will be the first published edition of it. And a little sneak preview for what's ahead after that, we have already been talking about doing volume 3 as well, which is the Assyrian conquest. But we haven't actually looked at a single word of that one yet. We're finishing up the Dark Age of Greece first. So.
Well, that's incredibly exciting.
Yes, it is very exciting.
And so much work.
It's fun though. It's a lot of fun. So I will say that much. It's just as much fun as it is work so far.
Nice. So with that, have you come across anything, or how does this? Because like you said, like historians are starting to have to accept some of these incongruent timelines and look at things under a different type of lens than what they've previously been viewing things under. So this type of work, your work, is integral to that process, because you dig in, man.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you do a great job. And
I have a hard time not seeing all the pieces as being related and connected, and I think that I have the hardest time trying to spell out all the ways they interrelate and connect. If anything.
Well, it's all one big web. How could we ever?
Yep.
It just goes on and it goes on. So, and that's part of why I asked now you to come today to talk about some of these things with us. Is there what would you think is the most important thing going on right now with your work that is?
Well, aside from the exciting things about Ages in Chaos Volume 2, the Dark Age of Greece. I, of course, a lot of people have been wondering for years now, literally years now, what's going on with the Jupiter myth. When is, another video coming out, or another edit of it? And I actually, I really have been working on this on and off basically ever since I put out the first video series. And there's been a handful of other things that have, come along to, also be worked on. But as far as the Jupiter myth goes, there's been two directions I've been working on it at, if you will, ever since the first 3 videos were released. One of those directions is making heavy revisions to the first of the 3 videos in the series. And by heavy revisions, I mean the sort of the backstory, setting up the whole the whole encounter between Jupiter and Saturn, of course, is the sort of a turning point in a much longer saga. So in the first part of the Jupiter myth, I had spent some time conjecturing on earlier arrangements of the solar system leading up into the Golden Age, the Saturnian system, and then from there to the terrible encounter with Jupiter, the breakup of the old system, and the beginning of the rearrangement towards our modern solar system. Now, however, when I was actually working on creating the first version of the Jupiter myth, I repeatedly encountered 3 problems or obstacles or hurdles that I knew I was going to have to go back and reapproach, take another look at, and try some new things out. And so when working on the Jupiter myth, those 3 things were, number 1 is that Cronus, as far as being the name of what we now call the planet Saturn, and embodying those type of archetypes in myth more or less worldwide, that is not the same as Chronos, the word for time. For one thing, they're spelled different. They have the different letters at the beginning of the word in the original Greek, even though that's sometimes hard to differentiate when it's transliterated into English. Just as basics, the planet, or the mythological character Saturn, Cronus, that is spelled in Greek with what we would say is the letter K. Um, the time, the word for time, is actually spelled with the letter chi, which is an X. The same thing that is like in, well, the word Christ, for example, or Christianity. That's that same that first letter as well. That X commonly gets translated as a CH in English, which, that really confuses things because it looks nothing like how it's spelled in Greek. But Saturn was not Kronos, time. Cronus and Chronos are not the same things. They're not the same etymology. The word for Saturn, Cronus, is the etymology goes back to, I think the word is crano, which is someone who rules or commands. I believe crano is a verb for ruling or commanding, actually, technically. So with the OS ending, this is a masculine form of a ruler or commander. We see actually this word come down into English in both a masculine and a feminine form. The word crone and crony are actually, those are literally derived from Cronus, the name for Saturn, not Chronos, the name for time. So that was one thing. It was like, that's a huge differentiation and separation where, otherwise, because, even in classical times, there was like a poetic use, sort of like a pun isn't the right word, but because the words were homonyms in Greek as well as in English, it was very apt to be played upon in creative rhetorical ways.
Right.
Even in classical time, even in classical Greece and Rome, for example. But nevertheless, a lot of the associations that then carry over when we're trying to study myths today, all the stuff to do with time and Saturn, that actually is not originally the same thing. They definitely became, a lot of overlap early on, but there's definitely some differentiation to be made there too. So let me not belabor that too much. The second point was that I kept repeatedly encountering is that when you go back to, one of my habits is to try to get in touch with the original language of any text that I'm reading. Like obviously I'm not going to be reading like ancient Sumerian or something. Like I can't read that, but I would like to know how the Sumerian words sounded. Probably how it looked in cuneiform. I don't know cuneiform. That's ridiculous. But a lot of times how the words sounded, if you will, or how it was pronounced, can tell us a lot because it might sound like a lot like other words in nearby languages. So going back to that kind of etymological basis, looking at the associations with Saturn being a polar star at the top of the planet Earth. Now, when you really go back into the myths, the very, very spare references that refer to where Saturn was located during the Golden Age, the words are actually saying things like the top of the sky. Sort of like, the apex of the vision overhead, like a zenith point overhead. They are never literally denoting the top of planet Earth. Now, there are certainly myths, once again, worldwide, of what we would call visible poles coming out of what we now, yes, agree is like the north and south pole of the planet. There's myths, in the Near East and in Egypt and in old Europe. There's myths in the ancient Americas as well that definitely refer to visible poles lighting up on the magnetic poles of the Earth. But these are not the same myth stories as the ones, like I said, spare references that refer to a location of Saturn being at the top of the sky or at the apex of vision. So once again, that's a discrepancy there too, and I kept coming upon that every time I would try to get deeper into what the original words meant, for example. And sometimes it's really instructive is, you compare 12 different sources and sometimes you find like 6 different ways of saying it in English. And it's like, sometimes that makes it more apparent, what the original was probably getting at least it seems to help. So the third point, and so far this sounds like the first two are maybe not related, so if they both refer to Saturn, this one might help tie it together and then kind of bring it forward here. So something I recognized in a lot of people's mythologies, basically around the Mediterranean area, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
the Near East, North Africa, is that the word that they used back then is Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
And that does mean the country Ethiopia, like it is now, but it also means a much wider stretch of Africa at that time. It was more of a general term for a much broader stretch of land. But repeatedly, in Greek myth, for example, that's where I first started noticing it because, working on the Jupiter myth, a lot of the focus was on the Greek story because that is, one of the most well-known stories. And if you really start going into the ancient myths, there's a lot of details scattered there that which is now really fun to pore over. So right there in Greek myth, repeatedly is how Ethiopia is considered the place that is closest to where the gods are. And it's the gods' favorite place, and the gods love hanging out there. They love feasting with the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians are like, the most blessed people on the planet. The Greeks are constantly saying this. It's right there in Homer repeatedly. A lot of times, like all of a sudden Poseidon shows up, and what's he been doing just before he shows up? He was down there in Ethiopia hanging out with his favorite people. So you hear that in Greek myth. You see it also in Egyptian lore, where they also refer to this place as the gods' land. As also being the holy place. So what's that about? So what's one thing I noticed is okay, what's going on in Ethiopia or that area of Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, that whole area. One thing that's going on is that that's where the equator is, and what's near the equator, of course, is also the ecliptic plane, which is primarily today, at least, where we see the planets. So in that regard, that's even true today. The gods come closest to that part of the world. But what's going on in earlier times when our solar system wasn't the same as it was now, and when this planet Saturn or Kronos is at the top of the sky, and he's also in his where all the gods' favorite places down in Ethiopia. So what's going on there? So that right, basically as soon as I got done making the first Jupiter myth and I made the videos and I put on the presentation a couple places and the video was up online, I immediately started working on a total revision of the Saturn system that instead put Saturn at the top of the sky over Earth's equator during the Golden Age, rather than above planet Earth. And at first, it was just an experiment. It was like there's just too many pieces of this puzzle, and I'm just going to see where it leads. So I started working on that in late 2016, and by the beginning of early 2018, I had actually rewritten the first part of the Jupiter myth completely. Not only the part with the Golden Age, but also the previous part, previous dynamics between Jupiter and Saturn. And just as I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent with that because I won't actually be producing that version of it. But at that time, I also went off and studied a tangent on what is the basic knowledge about binary star systems. Because in one model of Jupiter-Saturn system, for example, the polar configuration seems to suggest that that was a binary star system, at least at some point, with Jupiter and Saturn being the two binary stars. So in addition to beginning to rethink about putting Saturn at the top of the sky over the equator, I was also reading about binary star systems as far as the background for Jupiter and Saturn. And that was really fascinating. However, when I got that version done, I sent it out to a handful of people, including my mentor, John Cook. And we had some really interesting conversations about the third chapter, if you will, about the Golden Age. He was actually kind of intrigued about some of the stuff I was bringing forward, but the first two parts he tore to shreds, and it was just like, this is so bad, it's so wrong. I still have his handwritten, he handwrote critiques all over the printed page, and it's like, it was like, okay, this is good, and he apologized profusely at the time. I'm sorry, it's really bad, but I'm just like, don't apologize. I gave it to you because I trust you to tear it apart. I trust you to tell me it's wrong. So Thank you. Because otherwise, I don't know if it's right or wrong.
Right. So I gave it to him.
But he wasn't. Not trying to say he was, on my side of the story per se, but he was definitely intrigued by what some of the stuff I was saying about Saturn being at the top of the sky over the equator, and worked on that on and off as well. And I wasn't sure how to approach those earlier parts about Jupiter and Saturn because, especially with Saturn over the equator instead of above the North Pole,
Yeah.
earlier dynamics become kind of fresh questions again. I'm not going to talk about that, but I thought why not mention that just because it was something I worked on. It was I learned a lot, but it was probably a false path forward.
Mm. But still
However, I'm
interesting.
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry?
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, I was just saying it is an interesting thing to ponder.
Right
But
on, right on. So, what I'd like to do, and I have some images to share. One thing that then happened to really kind of bring me forward even further with this idea about Saturn being, located over the equator, if you will, Earth orbiting Saturn around Saturn's equator, obviously is what I'm saying. It still wasn't for a couple more years. It wasn't until late 2019 that I happened to find out that there was another associate of Velikovsky's who has left us about 8 years ago, unfortunately. His name was Lynn Rose, and it turns out, right around the time I was born, actually, he was working out a model of the Saturn system while in conversation with Velikovsky. It's not to say that Velikovsky per se endorsed his model, but it was initially begun in dialogue with him. They were close associates. They were like literally in the same place together commonly. Um, and not only did he work on a model of the Saturn system, he had Earth orbiting around Saturn's equator. And then I started reading his papers on that, and it was just like, oh, this is like what I've been, kind of really put together with a lot of hard effort and, mental imagery for the last 3 or 4 years. And it was just like, oh, here he had published it like when I was 1 year old, So now, because some of my model is a little bit different than his. Some of my model has things that his didn't necessarily think about, and he might have actually thought about a lot more than was ever published. And with the help of my good friend Louis Greenberg, I actually might have a chance, if COVID is ever really over, to actually take a look at Lynn's remaining materials, because there are surviving materials that have been unpublished, and I've heard a little bit more about some of that, and a lot of it sounds pretty interesting to get into. But so what I'd like to do is just some basic ideas about Earth orbiting Saturn around its equator, and how this resolves a lot of the Saturn symbolism that we still can pin down as being pretty universal. And so again, it's just kind of a beginning. I'm just going to try to touch on a bit some of the basics. I do have some graphics for this, so it might get a little bit more fun. And I also have to acknowledge that in part, some of what follows is I'm borrowing from Lynn's wonderful way of presenting it, because he wrote it so clearly. It's like I can't, why remake the wheel or whatever. Like I can't do it better than that. So I have to acknowledge that I'm borrowing from him a bit, because he said it so beautifully. Some images up here. Okay, so we're going to assume that Earth was in orbit around Saturn, and also that Saturn was in orbit around the Sun, and that Earth's axis of rotation, as we think about it today, was perpendicular to its plane of revolution around Saturn, meaning that Earth's period of revolution and its period of rotation were the same. What I'm getting at is that we're talking about Earth being what we might say is tide line, synchronous orbits of Saturn, where only one face is constantly facing Saturn, meaning that on the other side of Earth, Earth doesn't see Saturn. Excellent. Okay, so assuming that Earth was in orbit around Saturn, around its equator, and that's obviously not how this picture shows it. This picture is not meant to represent Earth orbiting Saturn per se. It does nicely show us their relative sizes. If anything, I would have, and I believe this is more along the lines of what Lynn was also saying, Earth would be more like, kind of more like in line with Saturn's equator. Something that Lynn does not mention at all is Saturn's rings or Earth rings. And just for the records, I know people are going to be wondering, even though I'm not really going to bring it up here henceforth, but with Earth positioned in around Saturn's equator, I kind of have the idea, and this actually also comes from reading myth, and I won't go too much into detail about this. This would be what is the detail for the revision of part one of the Jupiter myth, but that Saturn had a ring system during the Golden Age already. Earth and other planets orbiting it equatorially would have, similarly to moons that are in its ring system today, would have actually been embedded in the ring system itself, which provides some really, really fascinating visual perspectives, to say the least. I also think that, as many people have known from seeing the Jupiter myth and me talking about Earth rings, if you will, Earth's the terrestrial dust cloud, as NASA calls it themselves. Um, I now think this would be in the revision of the Jupiter myth that it being embedded in Saturn's rings when it was extruded from the Saturn system, that it's taking its whole magnetosphere with. So all the ring debris that's was still in Earth's magnetosphere, it came with it. So there's the origin of Earth's rings by themselves, if nothing else. Like I said, so there's that. This is this little added, little added bonus there, just in trying to offer a caveat about this illustration, which I just sort of randomly absconded with off the internet last night. So Earth in orbit around Saturn, and Saturn in orbit around the Sun. Earth's axis of rotation perpendicular to its plane of revolution, meaning that Earth's period of revolution, its year, and its period of rotation, its day, were equal. More specifically, meaning that only one side of Earth was facing Saturn, just like we see in all the modern satellites of Saturn, or Jupiter, or Uranus, or Neptune, and as we see almost happening with Mercury and Venus. They're not exactly orbiting synchronously around the sun, but they seem to be heading that way. Kind of makes you wonder if other planets in the inner solar system might also head that way someday. So we would find Earth in orbit around Saturn, and always keeping the same face towards Saturn, and that Saturn with Earth revolved around the sun, and there would have been some kind of year to that. How easy it would have been for Earthlings living on the planet Earth to actually know when that year was up. I'm not sure. Maybe there was some ways to tell. I haven't maybe thought that through enough yet, but night and day would still be solar phenomena, but caused by the revolution of Earth around Saturn. So Saturn is orbiting the sun, Earth going around Saturn, so that as Earth orbits around Saturn, it's going to alternately face the sun and turn away from it and face away from the sun. What's really going to happen is that the side that faces Saturn all the time, it's going to find itself once a day / once a year, remember they're the same thing. It's going to find itself where Saturn is positioned in front of the sun, sort of not necessarily eclipsing it, but occulting it. Even at night, so to speak, when Saturn is occulting the sun, it would still provide illumination. We still think that Saturn was still giving off its own light, not necessarily as bright as the sun, but it was still luminous, still a luminous, like brown dwarf, if you will. Kind of on its way to browning out, to borrow a term from other electrical fields. Saturn would be full at midnight, and that's when we would see it's most luminous, because it's able to occult at least part of the sun, perhaps the whole sun. We just, can't necessarily say, but let's just give it play with both ways, because that would also give us a really interesting visual phenomenon that would recur once a day / once a year. So Saturn full at midnight, and it would be more like a new moon at noon. It would still be luminous, but it would be, I'm not sure what the right words are there as far as like the sense of light. So with Earth in an orbit around Saturn as such, there would be a considerable variety of eclipse and occultation phenomena. It would be more frequent and more dramatic than any related phenomena today. Now, of course, a full solar eclipse today is a pretty awesome sight. So if you can imagine, it wouldn't necessarily be a full eclipse of the sun. It would be, Saturn at one point lining up to provide basically, if you will, like black hole in the center of the sun, but not exactly a black hole because it's still luminous. So sort of like a brown, it sounds terrible, in the center of the sun. But then you would have some of that phenomenon you have on Earth um, on full solar eclipses to this day, where it would appear to be dusk on all horizons all the way around you, 360 degrees. So it'd be very colorful, actually, and pretty freaky. It would definitely make the hair stand up on the. Thinking about it kind of makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Okay, I kind of covered that. Now, this is what also this gets kind of interesting because also during this transit of Earth around Saturn during a day/a year, there's going to be a time when the side that's facing Saturn is looking at Saturn, and it would be the nighttime because the sun is now on the other side of the Earth because of the way how Earth is positioned orbiting Saturn. This is why I wish I had some video. So this is why there's no Jupiter Myth Part 1 revision yet, because there's no video made of that yet. But we need videos of this to really illustrate it. So I'm going to try to do my best with words. And do I have... yeah, it's coming up. Okay. So at that point in time, when you have got that side of Earth that is facing Saturn, and you have the sun on the side of Earth that never sees Saturn, if you will, that side that is facing Saturn, there would then be a cast shadow of Earth, a shadow on the surface of Saturn. There would be an umbra, which is like a darker point, and then a penumbra surrounding that, a lighter tinged shadow. So once again, once a day/once a year, Earth's own shadow would align exactly right at the center of Saturn after, tracing a shadow path, from the one limb to the across to the other. And once again, you have this sort of eye phenomenon, or if you will, like the shaded dot in the circle, like sun symbol, if you will. That is one of the most oldest petroglyph symbols, for example. One of the oldest symbols that's been mimicked on all kinds of different scales. Obviously, this has been made really, really large on earthworks, and they all appear to be like late Neolithic work, like late Stone Age kind of stuff. So kind of gives us a period of time as far as when human cultures are possibly looking up and seeing this all the time if they happen to choose to live on that particular side of Earth.
What this suggests is that it was in the relatively recent past, like few thousand.
Yeah, definitely within the the Holocene era, if you will, in what we conventionally think of as the last 12 to 13,000 years, more or less. That's definitely still the range. I don't really think, for the most part, we don't really have examples of myth or petroglyphs that seem to reference periods of time before that. That's a whole other, I suppose, tangent, but I just thought, in case people were wondering, that's still that seems to be the frame of time that the myth phenomenon that we can still get in touch with as far as artifacts and old texts. It seems to unfold during that period of time. So with let's see. So the side that's facing Saturn again, there's going to be some differences between the side that faces Saturn versus the side that doesn't, and we've thought more about the side that is facing Saturn than the side that didn't. So that's why I end up talking about that more at this point in time in this sort of, in this sort of fashion. But so on that side that is facing Saturn, it would have a daytime in which the sun as we know it today would appear, and it would have a nighttime in which a nighttime sun, Saturn, would also be present. So it's conjecture. This is the point that Lynn Rose brought up. This is something I thought of on my own. It makes a really good point. So this side would have had relatively little or no cloud cover.
Mm.
But something that he didn't realize yet, and that's only because this relates to a phenomenon that was discovered after he had written the paper. Um, Actually, this is a much more recent phenomenon. Um, Earth, in this proximity to Saturn, once again embedded in its ring system, as I was suggesting earlier, is actually a crucial point to this. That side still would have been irrigated regularly by what is today called ring rain. This was observed by Cassini and the Huygens probe, for example. Um, the second side of Earth, by contrast, would have no second sun overhead day and night to burn off cloud cover. So the dark side, so to speak, if you will, it was still the dark side would still see the sun once a day and once a year. It would still have a day and a night. So calling it the dark side is kind of unfair. But the side is not facing Saturn would have probably more clouds and more rain. Um, it's also kind of significant that in a lot of traditional lore and myth, even coming down like closer into like times of classical Greece, you know, there's statements about like the edges of Earth being a place of mist and darkness, for example.
Right.
What's the edge? What's the edge of the Earth? Right? Oh, flat Earth. Right? No, 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 no.
No, right, but then it also gets you thinking about mass placement and type of matter, right? So does this affect where land is placed and where water is placed on a certain?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Lynn had some remarkable suggestions as far as the effect that it would have on the landmass on that side. And I'm not going to talk about that just yet because I want to bring up a few more points as far as the basic situation with Earth and Saturn. But I definitely do want to touch upon, we definitely will touch upon at least a little bit of that.
Okay.
Because yeah, that actually would have been very significant. And we might have a really interesting place to find some evidence for that. We'll get to that point in just a little bit, I promise. I promise. Let's see. Uh, I can kind of skip over some of this because some of it I just babbled out around the other things I was saying. Basically, because Earth's axis of rotation, blah 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 blah, being equatorial, Saturn located over Earth's equator, down there in Ethiopia, the god's favorite place, the top of the sky, pointing around Saturn. Earth to Saturn's plane around the sun being fairly low. This is just obviously a conjecture. Where the difference is that today, as many of us who are listening know, Earth deviates widely from its orbit deviates widely from the plane of the ecliptic, more so than any other planet in our solar system, which is the primary reason for the differentiation we experience in seasons throughout the year. So we're conjecturing, however, in this earlier system, when things are pretty stable, things are pretty peaceful, it's the golden age, right? Like things are pretty awesome and pretty rocking. And it's common lore all over the world that there really was no difference in seasons. So this sort of situation would definitely produce that as well. And this is, without even necessarily having to talk about like an anode shell per se. Not that necessarily one didn't exist, but you don't even need to conjecture that to, in this particular orbital arrangement. So it does not seem to have been in this. We're conjecturing that based on descriptions, the differentiation between, did Earth leave that equatorial ring and then come back to it, and did it bob up and down from the plane, as it does today? Lynn was thinking no, I was thinking no, I was actually thinking no based on the descriptions previous to him saying that, and definitely finding someone else that kind of corroborated was like, yay, yeah, okay, I think we're getting somewhere. So, not sure exactly how they measured years. That's something that has to be worked out because it seems that they could, because we have these astronomically large year counts for some of the so-called antediluvian, kings and patriarchs.
Yeah.
And it's also a very universal phenomenon as well. It's not only located in the Bible, but it's all located all over the place. Right. So if you think about the day and the year being the same amount, we're not necessarily talking about 24 hours. We're talking about a period of time that's longer than that, but how long? I sort of wonder if we start taking some of those numbers and thinking about them in that arrangement and start thinking about how many, the only way to think about it, at least comparatively, is like how many of our modern days might have fit into a day and night cycle / year cycle in this old system. That might be one way to start thinking about the math. Math is not my strong suit, but it has to be. I think it has to be thought about because there's just too many data points out there, and it's like, originally these weren't made up. Maybe some of them are incorrect or we can't read it right now, but they weren't just coming up with the stuff just out of the top of their heads or whatever.
Well, exactly. And they were living, because I was thinking that, I was like, if you lived a few thousand years or whatever, it would still, you wouldn't be very old if there's 360 days in a year, because we're not adding that extra 5 yet. They
Right.
don't have that extra 5 yet. So it's like, how many, those rotations. But if you think about that, we call it a day, 360 degrees. Is there, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would look at it geometrically, and that's just me
No,
going,
no, I think that's probably valid too. You have to kind of think about it, like spatially as well. It's this kind of count of time is the measurement of space as well. If you get what I'm saying, because it's the relationship between two objects or more than two objects, if you will. So yeah,
right. So it'd be like how many.
ratios. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like how many degrees in the circle, what's the time span of how long it takes? Like what's the arc though also, because it would matter how the distance between the
Yeah.
two bodies, that would give you exactly how long. But I think that's something interesting to really consider. Um and it also, I don't interrupt you
No, no, this is wonderful.
but it does give clues to not only, okay, so we started with etymology, and this is how you got to that. Kronos was like the crown on the top of the world, but it was actually on the top of the sky, and that's an important differentiation. It's an important difference,
Yeah.
because the pole is not the top of the sky in most of the world, but around the equator, and the way that all of this is going, and then also showing that it was within a period of time that we consider an era, a span of time, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
we've already decided that around 12,000, like 11.6 to 13.5 is an era of time. We've Because of the way that the behavior of the Earth has changed,
Right. Right.
went through periods for that. So there's congruencies on the surface of the planet for big changes to have occurred in that period of time, but it's so difficult to fathom that something like this was possible in that recent of our, because when people think about planets changing orbit and going in different directions and being in different spaces in the system, they think 4.6 billion years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Yeah.
Like, no, this is more recent than that,
Yeah,
and
it's like, well, then, are you telling me that humans were around back then and they were telling these stories for 4.6 billion years? No, I don't think you're telling me that. But how is it that all these people worldwide are telling these stuff? Are like, hey, these, it's just when you just read it at like face value today, especially one where it's translated as the modern name, planets. It's just like they're all talking about the solar system, like doing all kinds of crazy stuff it doesn't do today. It's like, how could it not be more plain? It's amazing, like all the ways that earlier scholars found to beat around that bush completely. And and of course not everybody. There's always been a catastrophist condition, tradition. It never ever stopped. It's always been around. It's been in the underground for it was in the underground for a long time, so to speak. It
well,
was heretical to talk about
right.
that stuff. You got burned at the stake and stuff like that.
But it's undeniable, especially when we really start to look at it, listen to the stories, do like you're doing, the comparing and contrasting, and then letting the stars and planets kind of tell the story for themselves.
Yeah. Yep.
That seems like they're doing, what you're just listening to them. I don't mean to simplify it in that sense at
No,
all, but
but it is the truth, and if you summarize it on a global situation, that's just the plain truth.
mhm.
So. Nothing simple about it, really.
Yeah.
Another interesting point, and this I just have to admit, this is something that I totally didn't think about. This is something that Lynn brought up, and then it was like, oh my gosh, this helps explain so much other myth. Um, you think about today, you think about planets orbiting Jupiter and Saturn, for example, today, because that is the model we're talking about for Earth and other planets in our inner solar system that we know today orbiting Saturn in this way. So, some other things that we see going on today in the modern Jupiter and Saturn system. For example, in the Jupiter system, in the relationship between Jupiter and Io, we have some probes that have detected something really fascinating and really consistent over the last, I don't know, 40 years or more. And there's a similar phenomenon going on in the Saturn system with Enceladus as well. And what kind of goes commonly popular by the name of flux tube, if you will, which
Yeah.
are these auroral foot points. Um, we're talking about a system at that time that the ring system is much bigger than it was today. It definitely had recently experienced a nova expulsion, which seems to have been the case for the Younger Dryas boundary event. So
Mm.
all the myth is happening in the aftermath of that. It's happening in the aftermath of a very dusty place, if you will. There's a lot of dust everywhere. And so, what does dust do? Well, it helps ionize things. What happens when things ionize? Like electrical or magnetic, blah, blah, blah. Well, they become luminous, they become visible, at least if those electrons are flowing at a certain speed.
Mm.
So, we could totally easily conjecture that in that type of environment, in the aftermath of that type of event, in such close proximity to that event, which may have actually been the cause of the whole ring phenomenon to begin with. That's a kind of a bundling of further conjecture out there, but might as well go ahead and conjecture it. Um, the point is that this flux tube that was connecting Earth and Saturn might have been very visible.
Mhm.
So this you got to kind of put yourself on the ground on that side of the Earth and think about that sort of massive of an object being luminous and it appearing to be connected to Earth and also you're going all the way out there into the top of the sky and connecting to something at the top of the sky. So this is sort of like it's like a trunk, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, Lynn talked about if you think about being sort of on the limb of planet Earth on the Saturn facing side, say like um, if Ethiopia, for example, is that's the area where that's Saturn is directly overhead, then let's say if you're over in China and Russia and you're looking down and on an angle on that, then this thing might kind of look like this weird sort of cone thing with like the smaller point of the cone, appearing to kind of go up and around the edge of the earth within the larger opening of the cone opening out to this thing that's kind of out there to the south, at what looks like as far as the sky goes. If you get what I'm sort of getting at there. Once again, this is where I need computer graphics because I think if we create like a 3D model of Earth and Saturn in this way, and we create the flux tube, basically based on the models we see with Io and Enceladus, and we make it luminous, and then can we drop some little humans down on that Earth globe and have them look around in that
Right.
3D model? I don't make 3D models on a computer, but I'm thinking it can be done, right?
It's positive
So is that
assurance.
some seeding some ideas for people that make computer models right through there? so, um, so this sort of pole, if you will, that is still sort of connecting Earth. This is sort of like a center or navel point, and it kind of becomes a little bit easier maybe to understand why. And one of the oldest symbols we have for Earth is this symbol divided by 4 quarters. It's also called like a sun circle and sometimes too. And it's like, well, wait a minute, this is Earth and what? It's a sun. It's a sun wheel. What? Kind of makes you look at some of these old compass roses in a new way.
Yes.
For example, so you would have like the 4 quarters, the horizontal line, the sort of east-west, being the equator, the vertical line being the meridian of the navel being right there at the center of the equator, the north and south sort of tracing a meridian, directly from that center. Um, what's interesting is that in a lot of, I find this more in older literature than modern literature, but older literature in the late 1800s, so at least the first half or more of the 20th century, when you look at literature as far as where was Earth's North Pole, what is the magnetic evidence? There's a consistent amount of volumes back then that talk about around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, a so-called North Polar area being centered around the South Sudan Basin, extended roughly from Lake Chad in the west to the modern Gulf of Aden in the east. That's some really anomalous information that's actually kind of hard to find today. When you look up the information today, they don't usually talk about that. I would like to get back to what was the data point back then that originated that it was so common that it was sort of copied for almost 100 years as if it were a fact. Um, so if you think about that, if correlating it to that data was, once again, I don't know the provenance of that data, and that's something I need to figure out for my own satisfaction before I would put it out there in a video. Aside from this video, this video is okay. You can actually, this is once again Lynn's suggestion more than mine, but you can actually then draw a meridian from that center point.
So the meridian lines went through Sudan, said that was the North Pole, right?
Well, there is, like I was saying previously, there was quite a bit of data suggesting that there was a North Polar region in what we now call the South Sudan Basin, extending roughly from Lake Chad in the west to the modern Gulf of Aden in the east. And this was approximated in this literature at around 7,000 to 8,000 years before the present. Now, there's a lot of interesting geography down there at that point that I just referred to, actually, the Gulf of Aden, if you will. Mm-hmm. Lake Chad is. Can you see my cursor move too? I think this is Lake Chad. I think this is Lake Chad, but Lake Chad is around this area. So we're talking about, there's detection. There was apparently magnetic anomaly detection stretching from here to here, suggesting a North Polar region between 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. I don't know enough about the data points to say anymore, but I want to, because maybe it's not valid. It could be not valid, but maybe
I've heard a story. But if
it is valid, it'd be interesting. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting geography down here, but this could require a whole other presentation. But what we're going to suggest, what has been suggested by many geologists, and just something that Lynn took up as well, is that this area, which I'm now circling with my cursor, hopefully that's still visible. Yeah. Down here at the very end of that, at the end of this red line, this is Aden. This is the Gulf of Aden right here. It appears that this part, this southern tip of Saudi Arabia, used to actually sit on the top of this part of Ethiopia and Eritrea. This right here, where my cursor is now in Africa, is the lowest, like, sea level place on Earth. And it's right up against some of the highest mountains in Africa. And if you examine the terrain that matches the highest mountains around it, that's the terrain at this southern tip over there in Saudi Arabia. So it kind of looks like the top of this terrain was sheared off, literally slid, possibly when this gulf was actually fractured open. So if we take that line from where we think it was centered, this would have actually, if my cursor is still visible, we were talking about during the Saturn era, this stretch of land actually being back here. It's just now located over here. If you take that line north, and you find a lot of interesting sites on that line, or really close to it. And once again, if we're thinking about a rather large fracture happening somewhere along there and possibly continuing upwards, that would, it kind of helps account for why some of these sites are to the north or the south or the east or the west of it. But they're all really, really, really darn close. I wish I could zoom in on this thing, but I will name them. So starting from the south at the equator, going north, we have Aden. Above that, we have Mecca, Sinai, Giza, Alexandria, Knossos, Delphi, Dodona, And now taking a big jump, because Dodona stood there in Greece,
Okay.
there could be other sites, but if you continue that line straight north, you'll end up at Stonehenge.
Wow.
So this is just my idea. I was like, well, so we're talking about Earth being, that's like Earth's actual orientation. So I just happened to
Yes.
take the graphic and spun it just a little teeny bit. I tried to center it so like there's the equator in the middle. I think I might have goofed it a bit,
No,
but
this is
hopefully
great
directing north. So
because
hopefully
remember,
this is, we're talking about, this is what's facing Saturn during the Golden Age.
yes, this is when Satan wanted to drive Apollo's chariot, and he drove it too close to the earth, and it scorched the earth and left a huge, scar in its wake, and that was the Sahara, how the Sahara Desert was made.
Oh wow. 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 Wow.
So it's just absolutely yes, because this is fantastic, and the fact that it goes to the stone circle sites and that it extends from these
Mhm.
holy sites, the holiest of sites, right?
Yes,
And
exactly.
where all of these big currents, and also you think about you were like the parting of the Red Sea, maybe, right, at some point, because this is like along this line of I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm
That
getting.
that might not be that might not be the same thing. You have a good point. This what's called the Red Sea today?
I'm I'm not
No,
sure,
I'm not sure.
but I'm saying
But
in
one
the
thing in
area.
the Book of Exodus, it's the Reed Sea, but
Reed
it
Sea.
doesn't. It's not really a point, but it could be related. It might not be.
I was just thinking of the parting of the sea, where you know what I'm saying,
Right.
where there was
It
like
would
this
still be, yeah.
turning of
I kind of think you would have well, you definitely have some flood going on.
definitely water
The
displacement.
water would be moving, water displacement, yeah, yeah. So it's interesting to actually put it on a globe a bit because then you can kind of get an idea, okay, other cultures that could have been viewing, what's happening out here, at the sort of center point that is facing Saturn. So of course we can see like India, and of course we see Persia, and of course we see China, and we see, all these other regions up here in Europe, um, the British Isles, so forth and so on. Um, this could be the meridian that the old Arabic map makers were using. Like you see, like on the Piraeus map and other maps that Charles Hapgood, for example, and others have been bringing forward. In general, they were all using a different prime meridian that went through Cairo. This does it goes through Giza, so it could be related, derived. I don't know, but it's something to think about as well. I don't know if that old meridian has been settled. Maybe it has been more settled since Charles Hapgood was looking at it. Hapgood's literature is about the newest I've ever read on it, and that's about as old as I am, or maybe even older. So,
Right. But he was talking about the Earth, the changes, plates, sheets, tectonics, however that, how those things in relation to one another. And that's also the interesting thing too, right? Is like the placement of these gigantic structures along these lines that are significant throughout the ages and maybe even for different reasons, and yet still maintain their significance, which makes me wonder about them just on a sphere.
yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of awesome and fun work to be done for people who can work with computer graphics and especially involving like GPS and stuff like that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that the Google Street View as it works on Google Earth or on Google Maps isn't exactly going to do the trick because we can't look up and look into the past. But we need, basically that same basic template, only with the ability to reposition the objects in the sky too. I know it sounds like it's asking for a lot, but I think with computer graphics, it's not really asking for very much these days.
No, and not really, not augmented reality. Like you could even do it with like where you create the background and then have augmented reality, so you're kind of still in
Oh,
the
yeah.
scene. Like you could
Oh,
make it
wow.
I'm seeing it
Yeah.
like walking around in normal purview, like you're looking out your window and that's like the river and the tree that's always there, but now Saturn's behind it. It's hanging
Just
out.
can you now see me attempting to play a video?
No, now I'm still seeing your bubbles. You got to share the screen again.
Okay, we're gonna redo that because um,
When you clicked off the map, it went back to your bubble.
okay. You saw the map where I turned
I did.
it north. All right, very good.
Definitely did see
What
that.
I also want to show you is what this area that is now in Ethiopia, where it looks like the mountains were sheared away and ended up being the southwest tip of Arabia. The landscape there in Ethiopia is the most unique and alien on Earth. It is absolutely astounding. Um, Absolutely nothing lives there. Nothing lives there. It is extremely, well, they consider it volcanic. It's very sulfurous. Um, More than anything else, the video is playing terribly. The video is actually really, really clear. We will make sure that the URL of this video, oh, it's playing a bit more clearly now. I'll get you the URL and maybe share the URL on the video screen
Yeah,
as well.
for sure.
But it is often too hot to really like be outside for too long. This might be like winter. These people are actually out there walking on. Are those dry beds of sulfur? I don't know. I'm getting a lot of buffering, I think, because I'm on Skype as well. But um, definitely check out um, these particular areas in Ethiopia. One word that it's this whole region is called the Afar Triangle. And there are these areas that are less active and that are basically these dried out. It's all kinds of chemical constituents. When you actually go out there and do chemical analysis, it resembles the floor of the sea more than anything else, oddly enough. And it's obviously it's is this what's at the bottom of mountains or the bottom of a volcano?
Right. Well, like
There's I
that's
mean
what was
no one has
inside.
any
Like
answers about this place.
it's like an MRI machine when you slice off you take the slices of the
Yeah,
image. But this is like it just took the top of it off, and so we're kind of seeing like the guts of the earth.
yeah.
I mean,
There
that's
are there are remains of little teeny towns out there that are just in absolute ruin, but they're not that old because like there's like rusted out pickup trucks from like the 50s there. But I mean, if someone told me, hey, this is a close up of a moon, around Saturn, I've been like, oh yeah, I guess so. Like, there's nothing like this on Earth, right? No, there really is. But like I said, it's really inhospitable. It's you cannot. I don't know if you can get into that liquid or not. Maybe you can. Maybe you have to have a special suit on. There's no water to drink. There's nothing
all
growing. There's no animals. There's no insects. There's no birds.
no,
No
because
one.
what
No one has any knows what to do about this landscape.
but I'm sure the decay on the vehicles, like you said, the rusted out cars. I mean, I'm sure that's like accelerated, and
Yeah, I can only imagine living in this environment. You just imagine everything was just constantly, just going to decay just from being, having this in the ambient environment. Not only this, because actually, it's kind of beautiful. I mean, the colors are fantastic. It's strange and bizarre and alien, but it's actually kind of beautiful in this part of the Afar Triangle. However, there are other parts that
I'm
are
wondering how
light.
it smells though. If it
Oh, it
smells,
stinks. It smells so bad. It smells so bad. It smells just like I mean like serious rotten egg kind of stuff. But then like any other smell that you think about being at a volcano. Okay, that's not a volcano. That's their campfire. It's like because they start out at night here. This is also in another part there in the Afar Triangle. I don't know how to pronounce that. Dalol, Ethiopia. I'm
I am
probably
not the person to
butchering
ask
that
how to pronounce it
pronunciation,
right
but
here.
that's
Yeah.
definitely a word to look up as far as finding really cool images. I actually had this cue to start later, and it's starting earlier. I'm going to try to skip ahead. Is it now showing you volcanic activity?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so this is in fact the majority of the Afar Triangle is doing stuff like this right now. And those other parts are like used to be active like this, but are now like cooling out, if you will.
Mm. Annealing. I feel like they're going through the annealing process, and
Yeah,
it's still
yeah.
being merged. It's
There's so much to. I mean, even though there's no answers, to this kind of these issues of geology, but there's especially with the internet, there's so many cool pictures and videos of this area. I definitely recommend people to go check it out and open your mind as you open your eyes and start thinking, start conjecturing, start putting two and three and four together, and because we have a lot of interesting things on this earth. A lot of interesting, unexplainable things. This is going on right, in just a few miles away, more or less, if you will. There's, terrain that is completely solid and appears like it's been solid for millions and billions of years. But this place, it's seething.
it is. It's got so much life to it. It's churning,
Yeah.
churn.
Yeah.
Wow.
There's so much like I don't know if kinetic energy or kinetic force is the right word, but like I said, there's absolutely nothing living here. There's no, aside from the attempts to set up towns that were probably mining salt or other minerals.
Mm.
Actually, I think there's incredible salt mines out here. So they were probably like for mining purposes, but they don't last.
So this thing is showing tide in the volcano,
Kind of, yeah.
according to the sun, because at sunrise it was very active and crazy. At noon it was a little more chillaxed, and now that it's nighttime, it's starting to.
Uh-huh.
But
It
it's
appears it's definitely more active during the middle of the day. Yeah, you totally got that right.
sunrise is like crepusculus dawn is one of the most ionically active
Yeah.
times, and that's something that's really really interesting. And I'm probably gonna have to go on this note to
Well, it's fine. We've been talking for quite some time, but I hope it
yeah, I've
was
taken up a
interesting.
lot of your time today, but that crepusculus dawn and dusk are forever and always on the earth. They're just not always where you are.
Oh,
Like
that's a good point. That's a really good point. That's not. It's. I mean, wow. Yes, good point. Ah,
yeah. So when that's interesting. It's like that charge is moving through at that pace, like you were talking about at a full. So this is. I'm just going to leave you with the full things because I'm going to be a few things because these are the things I'm leaving considering,
cool.
and then I will email you another 30 lists to get my last list. Um, but so if if this crepusculous position, we'll say, which we'll also call in our oxygenated environment of planet Earth the color red. Um, it's like that point where blue and black of the night get together and the refraction turns like it kind of like bump it slows down so it turns to red, and that is going around the earth at all times. And so when we're in this configuration of Saturn and being in tidal lock to Saturn but at the same time orbiting around the sun, how
Yeah.
do those two types of um, dawn and dusk affect our telluric currents, the global electric circuit, how things behave. It's like
How humans interact with one another, perhaps even.
yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the circadian rhythm of it all? I don't know, but that's what I'm going to be
So
thinking.
maybe not yet, but it may be yet. But it's someday we will be able to conjecture that with like serious data. Maybe already. I just don't even know. I don't even know what's all out there sometimes in all those other fields of study that I don't know that much about yet. So.
That's why it's hard to know anything at all. I mean, when you like, that's why they say the more you know, the more you realize
Yeah.
how little you know. Because there's so much, and that's why it's important for us to do things like this where we present things to each other, communicate with each other, and ask each other
Yeah.
questions, to people who haven't who haven't heard of Immanuel Velikovsky or John Cook in Saturnian cosmology, these are things that are coming to the forefront, whether the forefront likes it or not, because they are.
Yeah.
So
So
it's
right.
important for us to be able to talk about these things subjectively and objectively. And I really, Jillian, I love talking to you.
Yeah, it's a blast. We should do this again, like in a few months or something. I actually prepared notes for a couple other things, and it is totally fine. We didn't do that. We only did this tonight because I think it worked out really well. But um, I'm ready to go in a couple other months or something.
I would love that. I would absolutely love that. Yeah, I think that this is a great stopping point for this part, because I think that the next part is going to
Yeah,
be
for sure.
a
Yeah.
whole conversation in itself. That's what I mean. Like, that's why I had to
Yeah.
put an hour on these, because I get talking to people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And my kids are out there screaming and my dogs are barking, and I'm like, I know Jupiter's like, like, take a break for a minute, and then I go back to reality.
Yeah,
So
the other part I've been working on the Jupiter myth. This will just tantalize you for the next time. Is beefing up the third part, which is dealing with like Venus Earth catastrophes and stuff like that.
yeah,
So that's the other aspect I've been working on. We can talk about that next time if you like, because I've got quite a bit. Even got slides for that.
I
Or
would love.
we can
Yes,
do
yes.
anything else too. Really. But
Yeah, I would love to talk about. I would love to talk about that, because that's something that I don't think it's enough attention paid to it, because and they're like the two strong feminine archetypes, the two strong
Yeah.
feminine aspects, and we pay a lot of attention to the masculine aspects because they're action oriented, like this
Sure.
passiveness of these things. And I think that especially Venus, I would love to dive into talking about Venus a little bit more, and why we see it the way we do, and who we see it the way we
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
associated with it,
Yeah.
for sure. And so, now for your part of your announcement, I didn't want to ask you this to last, so that people would not get
Sure.
get information. So when will this be available? These new volumes of Velikovsky?
Okay. We are, provisionally hoping that we might have this next one out as soon as next year. Um, we're in a stage now of going over the manuscript, and it's making, basically it's like proofreading, just to make sure we have a good tight grip of the manuscript that isn't full of errors or anything like that. We're not really correcting it per se. We're not like changing his words. We're not doing anything like that. But after that is done, then we'll get galleys and proofs. Then we'll make sure that everything we want in there is the way it should be. So I actually don't know how much time that process takes. I imagine because so much happens digitally, and,
Right.
and the files that we're putting together to send are digital files, that it's probably going to happen a lot sooner than it used to. And so it's going well. If we keep up this pace, we are hoping as soon as next year we'll have volume 2, The Dark Age of Greece.
Hey, that's much faster than 25 years between volumes. Okay.
I know, yeah. Yeah. And we're planning on jumping right into the next one, probably soon after we briefly celebrate that one, and then we'll get right on to the next one.
That is so good to hear. That's so exciting. We're all going to be sitting on the edges of our seats waiting for that, for sure. For sure.
Cool. Glad to hear that. That's what we're hoping to hear.
Yes. Thank you
We're
so
on the edge
much.
of our seats editing it. Oh my gosh.
I bet. Well, you have a wonderful, wonderful night, Julian, and I will
Thank you.
talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.